Across the United States, universities face a defining moment. Recently, the University of Minnesota has joined roughly 140 other major universities in adopting policies of institutional neutrality, effectively barring official statements on matters of public concern. Supporters hail these policies as protective measures shielding campuses from partisan division, while critics see them as troubling abdications of moral responsibility. However, to frame this debate merely as neutrality versus advocacy oversimplifies and even obscures the deeper issue, the timeless tension between centralized institutional authority and genuine intellectual pluralism. To understand what's truly at stake today, we must look beyond immediate political contexts and grasp the longer historical perspective. The core struggle over speech on campuses mirrors a centuries-old battle exemplified vividly in episodes such as Galileo's persecution by the Inquisition, the Protestant Reformation's challenge to institutional dogma, and the Enlightenment's embrace of pluralistic intellectual debate. History demonstrates repeatedly that institutions seeking to impose either orthodoxy or enforce silence inevitably fail, undermining their own credibility and stifling progress. In 1633, Galileo Galilei stood trial before the Roman Inquisition for supporting heliocentrism, a viewpoint deemed heretical by the Catholic Church. The Church's insistence upon a single institutionally sanctioned truth, geocentrism, reflected not merely a scientific error but an attempt to enforce orthodoxy across political, theological, and intellectual domains. The result? Galileo's forced silence, house arrest, and suppression of groundbreaking ideas. Yet ultimately, history vindicated Galileo and profoundly damaged the Church's authority. Today's universities risk entering the Galileo trap when administrators present institutional viewpoints as absolute truths. Whether defining particular social or political theories as unchallengeable or marginalizing dissenting opinions, institutions that enforce orthodoxy alienate public trust and create fertile ground for political backlash. The resonance of criticisms, such as those voiced by President Trump, lies precisely in the recognition that institutional overreach and arrogance provoke public rejection, just as the Church's rigid orthodoxy did centuries ago. Responding to backlash, universities now increasingly seek refuge in enforced neutrality, effectively silencing official institutional speech altogether. But this approach misunderstands the lessons of history. When the Catholic Church sought to avoid controversy by silencing Galileo, it didn't achieve peace or neutrality. It created resentment, resistance, and long-term intellectual stagnation. Similarly, universities in the 1960s sought neutrality through silence, notably at the University of California, Berkeley, forbidding political advocacy on campus grounds. This strategy backfired spectacularly, igniting the free speech movement and sparking widespread unrest. The tragedy at Kent State University during Vietnam War protests similarly demonstrated the dire consequences of enforced silence. When institutions attempt to silence controversy rather than openly addressing it, tensions rise, mistrust grows, and conflicts escalate. Today's neutrality policies follow the same mistaken logic. By centralizing control over speech, administrators inevitably ignite resistance rather than quell it. Silence does not foster true neutrality. Instead, it amplifies tensions by forcing dissent underground, precisely as historical examples repeatedly illustrate. Contrast these failures with historical periods when decentralized, pluralistic speech flourished. During the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther challenged the centralized authority of the Church, promoting direct engagement and debate over religious ideas. The Reformation's decentralized approach shattered institutional orthodoxy and unleashed a wave of intellectual, social, and cultural innovation. Similarly, during the Enlightenment, vibrant intellectual ecosystems flourished in Europe's coffeehouses where philosophers, scientists, and revolutionaries openly debated diverse viewpoints. These spaces, defined by decentralization and pluralism rather than institutional dictates, generated remarkable progress precisely because they allowed ideas to compete freely, unencumbered by centralized authority or enforced silence. When American universities embraced similar openness in the late 20th century, such as during anti-apartheid activism of the 1980s, they experienced renewed civic engagement and intellectual vitality. Rather than enforcing silence or imposing institutional orthodoxy, successful institutions trusted their communities to debate openly and democratically. The result? Increased trust, civic responsibility, and meaningful social change. The United States was founded upon the Enlightenment principles of free speech, free press, and free assembly. Our founding fathers deliberately avoided centralized intellectual authority, recognizing clearly the dangers posed by institutions claiming monopoly over truth. America's earliest public squares exemplified vibrant, pluralistic debates, thriving precisely because diverse voices challenged, debated, and refined ideas openly and publicly. Today's universities are uniquely positioned to carry forward this foundational democratic legacy. Yet current policies advocating institutional neutrality as enforced silence represent a dangerous retreat toward centralization and intellectual control reminiscent of Galileo's persecutors and Berkeley's misguided administrators. This is neither neutral nor democratic. The way forward lies in empowering decentralized democratic pluralism on campus. Rather than centralizing speech under administrative control, whether through silence or enforced orthodoxy, universities must empower multiple independent voices within their communities. Faculty groups, student organizations, academic departments, and affiliated entities should freely express their collective positions, fostering vigorous, open debate. In this pluralistic ecosystem, administrative responsibility shifts from imposing viewpoints toward creating and sustaining an environment conducive to free inquiry and democratic engagement. Institutions become facilitators of diverse perspectives rather than gatekeepers dictating what may or may not be spoken. Such decentralization doesn't weaken universities. It enriches their educational mission, reinforces their intellectual credibility, and safeguards their civic role. Universities stand at a historic crossroads reminiscent of pivotal moments stretching from Galileo to Berkeley. History unmistakably shows that enforced silence and institutional orthodoxy, two sides of the same authoritarian impulse, always fail in the long run. The only enduring path is pluralism, decentralized, democratic, and intellectually robust. Thus, the current debate about institutional neutrality is not a tactical political choice. It is a foundational philosophical decision about the identity and future of higher education itself. Universities must reject both the false neutrality of enforced silence and the dangerous arrogance of institutional orthodoxy. Instead, by embracing genuine pluralism and democratic decentralization, they reaffirm their essential historical role, vibrant ecosystems of intellectual freedom, inquiry, and progress. In reclaiming this proud tradition, universities not only honor the legacy of Galileo, Luther, and the Enlightenment, they also fulfill their highest democratic promise to society itself.